I work at a small gas station on the outskirts of town. It's a quiet place, especially at night when the traffic dies down, and the only people who come by are truckers or the occasional traveler. My job is usually pretty boring, keeping the place clean, taking payments for gas, and selling snacks from the vending machines. Nothing exciting, but it's a job. One night, everything changed. It was a regular night shift. I was working from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. By midnight, there were barely any cars, which was typical for this time. The night felt even quieter than usual, and I remember thinking it was strange how empty the road was. Around 2 a.m., an old car pulled up, covered in dirt. I didn't think much of it at first, but I noticed that the driver stopped at the farthest pump, even though all the others were open. He didn't get out right away, and I could see him sitting in the car, doing something but not getting gas. A few minutes passed, and I started to wonder what was going on. Usually, people either get gas or come inside to pay, but this guy just sat there. It felt off. Finally, he got out of the car. His clothes were old and tattered, and he looked like he hadn't showered in days. He was probably around 50, with a scruffy beard and dirty hands. But what really got to me was his eyes. There was something unsettling in the way he looked at me. He didn't seem like a regular person just stopping for gas. There was something more dangerous in his stare. He slowly walked toward the store and opened the door. Inside, it was dead silent, and that's when I realized that not a single car had passed by for hours. He approached the counter, but he didn't say anything. I waited for him to speak, but he just stared at me. Finally, I broke the silence. "Can I help you with something?" He still didn't say a word, just stood there, leaning closer to the counter and staring into my eyes. My hands started to shake slightly. "If you're getting gas, just tell me the pump number," I added, trying to keep my voice steady. Instead of answering, he turned and walked over to the vending machine but didn't pick anything. He circled around the store a few times, not touching a thing. Finally, he came back to the counter and his face was closer to mine than before. I asked again if I could help, but he just slowly nodded, then turned and walked out the door. It didn't seem threatening at first, but the whole situation was making me uneasy. He got back in his car, but he didn't leave. He just sat there, staring in my direction. I thought about calling the police, but I felt like I'd be overreacting. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet. I tried to focus on my work and ignore him, but the eerie silence outside kept gnawing at me. Suddenly, I heard a loud noise from outside, like something heavy had dropped onto the asphalt. I looked through the window and saw the man stepping out of his car again, carrying something in his hands. He was heading towards the tree line behind the gas station, holding a large black bag. As he reached the edge of the lit area, he stopped and looked back, straight at me. Our eyes met, and a wave of dread washed over me. He stood there, frozen for a few seconds, and then disappeared into the darkness. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. I tried to convince myself it was just garbage, that he was throwing away old junk. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. After what felt like an eternity, I heard his car start up again. He drove slowly toward the exit and disappeared down the road. I was left alone, my heart still racing. I stared out into the dark woods where he had vanished, but I couldn't bring myself to go out there. I decided to call the police and report the strange incident. A couple of hours later, they arrived and searched the area behind the station. They found a bunch of random items scattered around the woods, but nothing that could explain what had happened that night. The man was never found, and neither was his car. To this day, I don't know what he was doing with that bag or what was inside it. My mind keeps going to dark places, imagining the worst, but honestly, I'd rather not know. After that night, I quit my job at the gas station. I don't ever want to be alone on a night shift again, especially when there's no one around to help if things go wrong.
I've been debating for months whether I should even share this. What happened to me last summer still gives me nightmares. My name is Sarah, and a year ago I went on a trip with my friend Jake. We've known each other for years. We went to college together, shared the same friend group, and had always been close. But recently, I'd started to feel that Jake was seeing me as more than a friend. People had teased us about becoming a couple over the years, but we always laughed it off. Jake had always been respectful, so when he suggested a getaway, I didn't think twice. He found this cozy little cabin on Airbnb in a small town called Bradwood, New York. It seemed like the perfect way to escape city life for a bit and relax. The cabin was nestled on the edge of a forest with a stunning view of a lake. We arrived late in the evening, and everything felt just right. But from the moment we stepped out of the car, there was an odd tension in the air, like the forest was watching us. Or maybe just me. The first night passed uneventfully. We had dinner on the porch, watching the moon reflect on the lake. It was peaceful, and I thought I'd finally found a place to unwind. But somewhere in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. It was faint at first, like a tapping on the windows. I stayed perfectly still, listening. It was as if something or someone was brushing up against the cabin, checking the place out. Morning came, and I told Jake what I had heard. He laughed it off, teasing me about being paranoid and claiming it was probably some animal. I forced myself to laugh too, but something about his reaction bothered me. He was trying too hard to be dismissive. And then there was the way he'd been looking at me lately. Not like the Jake I knew. More intense, like he was waiting for something. That day, we decided to take a hike through the forest. The trees were tall and ancient, their thick branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was heavy, like the forest had its own heartbeat. We didn't talk much, and when we did, the conversation felt forced. I caught Jake watching me more than once, his gaze lingering in a way that made my skin crawl. When we got back to the cabin, the tension was palpable. Jake started making small comments, casually suggesting that maybe we should consider being more than friends. He played it off like a joke, but there was an edge in his voice that unnerved me. I tried to steer the conversation in another direction, pretending not to notice, but it was clear he wasn't going to drop the subject. That night was worse than the first. I woke up again, but this time the sound was different. It wasn't just a tapping. It sounded like footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I got up and tiptoed to the window. Through the darkness, under the faint moonlight, I saw a figure. It was standing at the tree line just beyond the cabin, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. Panicked, I immediately went to check on Jake, but when I reached his room, the bed was empty. Fear gripped me. Where was he? Was that him outside? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I grabbed my phone and tried calling him, but before the call could even go through, the door to his room creaked open. Jake stood there in the doorway, staring at me with an unsettling calmness. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice oddly flat, as if he didn't care about the figure outside or my panic. I thought I heard something," I stammered. "Were you outside just now?" He hesitated for a split second before shrugging, then gave me this strange, almost predatory smile. "You're just imagining things, Sarah. Probably just your nerves. Go back to bed." But was I imagining it? His behavior had been off ever since we arrived, and now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I made up my mind. I was leaving. I told Jake that I needed to head back to the city early for work. He didn't seem happy about it, but didn't argue either. As we packed up the car, he turned to me and said, "Are you sure you want to leave? We've still got a couple more days here. It's peaceful, isn't it?" The way he said it made my stomach drop. There was something behind his words, like a challenge. His eyes looked different. Not like the Jake I had known for years. I could feel the weight of his stare as I loaded the last of my bags into the car. I forced a smile and shook my head. "No, I really have to go." As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Jake stood there, watching the car disappear down the road, his expression blank. And as I sped out of Bradwood, I couldn't shake the thought, what would have happened if I had stayed? I still think about that trip, about the figure in the woods and the way Jake's behavior changed so suddenly. I wonder if I'll ever know what was really going on in Bradwood. But one thing's for sure, I'm never going back to find out.
I've always considered myself a pretty tough guy. Working as an EMT, I've seen things that would haunt most people. Car crashes, tragic accidents, scenes that others wouldn't forget for years. But there's a big difference between witnessing the aftermath of something terrible and becoming part of a mystery that chills you to the core and makes you question your own memory. This happened last year, in the late fall. It was a routine shift, answering evening calls, nothing out of the ordinary. We were about to wrap up for the night when the last call came in. The dispatcher told us it was an elderly woman who had dialed 911. She lived alone in an old house on the edge of town. The nearest neighbors were a few houses down. The operator said her voice was shaky, clearly frightened, but she hadn't explained exactly what was wrong. She just sounded scared. We headed to the address. The house stood at the end of the street, old and worn, with a dim light glowing from one of the windows. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open, revealing a frail, elderly woman. She looked genuinely terrified, but physically she seemed fine. "I'm sorry for bothering you," she said, her voice trembling. "I probably shouldn't have called. It's just strange things have been happening lately." We stepped inside. The house was old but tidy, every room dimly lit with a soft yellow glow. The woman led us to the kitchen and offered us seats at the table. I asked her what had been going on. "At first I thought it was just my imagination," she began, wringing her hands nervously. "But for the past few weeks, I've been hearing footsteps at night, inside the house. At first it was faint, like someone walking in the other room. But last night, I swear, I heard someone walking directly under my bed." My partner and I exchanged glances. We'd heard similar stories before. Elderly people often experience loneliness, and it can stir up all kinds of fears. Still, we kept a straight face and continued asking her questions. "Have you checked the house?" I asked. "Maybe someone got in?" I checked, of course. All the windows and doors are locked. And who would come here? The house is so far from anyone else. We decided to take a look around the house, just in case. We inspected every room. Nothing unusual. Everything seemed in order. No signs of a break-in, no strange noises. After completing the sweep, we returned to the living room, ready to tell her that everything was fine. But then something strange happened. The phone rang. The woman immediately went pale. She looked at the phone, then at us. "It's him," she whispered. "Him?" I asked, confused. "The one who comes at night," she replied, her voice shaking. I picked up the phone to try to calm her down. On the other end of the line, there was silence. But after a few seconds, I heard something. Quiet, slow breathing. I asked who it was, but no one answered. The line went dead after a minute. We decided to stay in the house for a little while longer, just to make sure everything was fine. The woman looked on edge, and I understood why. An old house, isolation, her age. It all seemed like the perfect combination to stir up fear. After assuring her she could call us again if something else happened, we left. The next day, I couldn't shake the memory of that house. Something about it stayed with me. During the evening shift, I asked the dispatcher about the call. I wanted to know more about the situation, but the operator looked puzzled and told me no call had come from that address. I froze. "What do you mean there wasn't a call?" I asked. "I was there. We spoke to her." The operator checked the logs again. No calls from that number had been received. Not last night, not in the last few weeks. That was strange. I decided to call the local police station to make sure everything was okay with the woman. The officer on the other end of the line paused and then asked me, "Are you sure you're talking about that house?" "Yes, I'm sure," I said, giving him the address. After a long silence, he said, "That house has been vacant for years. The woman who lived there passed away 2 years ago." My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We were there. We spoke with her. We checked her home. I hung up the phone. But ever since that night, I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a misunderstanding. And now, sometimes, late at night, I'll get a phone call. And when I pick up, all I hear is that same quiet, steady breathing on the other end of the line.
My name is Jake, and a few years back, I worked as a seasonal fire lookout in one of the remote towers in Wyoming's National Park. It was the perfect job to escape the noise of the city, have some solitude, and make a little extra cash. The work wasn't difficult. I just had to keep an eye on the forest and report any signs of fire. But one night, something happened that still haunts me to this day. The tower I was stationed at was located deep in the forest, far from any hiking trails. You could only get there by hiking or using an old jeep, which dropped me off at the beginning of the season. From the tower, the forest stretched out endlessly, like a green ocean as far as the eye could see. But at night, the place transformed into an eerie, foreboding wilderness where every sound echoed, and the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. It was my fourth night on duty when I noticed something strange. Usually the nights were quiet. I'd hear an occasional owl hooting in the distance, or the howls of coyotes, and the crackling of the campfire outside would remind me that I wasn't entirely alone in the world. But that night, something felt off. Around 11 p.m., I noticed a light in the distance. It was faint, barely visible, flickering among the trees. At first, I thought it might be hikers, somehow lost and wandering in the restricted area of the park. But the light was too dim to be a flashlight or campfire. I stared at it for a few minutes, and then suddenly, it vanished. A sense of unease washed over me. No one should have been out there at this time. The terrain was difficult to navigate, and the nearest campsite was miles away. I climbed to the top of the tower and grabbed my binoculars to get a better look, but there was nothing. The forest was once again consumed by darkness. That feeling of something being wrong wouldn't leave me. I tried to distract myself, turning on the radio and making some tea, but the unease gnawed at the back of my mind. I kept replaying the image of the light over and over. It didn't make sense. Maybe it was a poacher or someone who got lost. Just as I began to calm myself down, I heard it. A faint noise, like someone moving at the base of the tower. Slow, deliberate footsteps, the kind someone makes when they're trying not to be heard but can't help but break a branch or disturb the underbrush. I froze. The sound stopped, but the tension lingered in the air. Then it came again. The soft crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. I cautiously walked over to the window and peered outside, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything clearly. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bear or a wolf, but the footsteps sounded too human. I decided to try the radio again and contact the main office, but the signal was weak, and all I could hear was static. That only made me more anxious. I turned off the lights in the tower, hoping not to draw any attention, and sat by the window, straining to listen. An hour passed, and I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were much closer, right at the base of the tower. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed the door lock, double-checking that it was secure. Whoever or whatever it was, they were standing there, just below me in the darkness. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. Then I heard it. The unmistakable creak of the wooden stairs. Someone was coming up. I felt cold dread seep into my bones. I moved silently toward the door and locked it, hoping the sound didn't give me away. The steps stopped right outside the platform. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands trembling, and aimed it down the stairs. The beam illuminated a figure standing on the lower platform, looking up at me. The person was wearing a hoodie, the hood pulled up to hide their face. They just stood there, staring at me, not saying a word. "Hey, what are you doing out here?" I shouted. Though deep down, I knew I wasn't going to get an answer. The figure didn't move. I grabbed my radio and tried calling for help again, but all I heard was the crackle of static. Panic was rising. The stranger took a slow step toward the stairs, and without thinking, I threw the flashlight at them. It missed, but it startled them enough to make them pause. That was my chance. I bolted for the back door of the tower, which led to a set of emergency stairs on the other side. I sprinted down the metal steps as fast as I could, the metallic clanging echoing through the night. I could hear footsteps behind me, but didn't dare look back. I ran into the forest, adrenaline surging through me. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to keep going, to get as far away as possible. I ran blindly, not caring where I was going. After what felt like an eternity, I finally stopped and crouched behind a large rock, trying to catch my breath. The night was eerily silent again. I listened for any sound of pursuit, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement. I sat there for hours, my back pressed against the cold rock, afraid to move until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When the sky started to lighten, I cautiously made my way back to the tower. Everything looked just as I'd left it. The door was locked, and nothing seemed disturbed. It was like the entire thing had never happened, but I knew it did. The next day, I quit my job and left the tower for good. I don't know who that person was or why they were out there, but ever since that night, I've never felt comfortable in the woods. Not alone, not in the dark.